Our first story takes place in a small-town high school, where a routine day turned into a nightmare. Emily, a senior, was in her math class when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a lockdown. It was a drill, they thought, until the lights flickered and the air grew cold. I had been sitting in my usual spot in the back row, trying to focus on the algebra equations my teacher had written on the board. The principal's voice interrupted the monotony, but no one was alarmed. Lockdown drills had become a routine part of our school life. As instructed, we moved to the designated lockdown positions. My class huddled in a corner. The room fell silent except for the muffled instructions from other classrooms and the distant echo of doors closing and locking. I settled in beside my best friend, Amanda. Minutes ticked by, and we began to relax, whispering among ourselves and checking our phones. But then, something strange happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into an eerie semi-darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of our phones and the small windows high on the walls. A chill ran down my spine. It was mid-spring, and the school's heating system should have kept the building comfortably warm, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop noticeably. I glanced at Amanda, who shrugged, clearly just as confused but not particularly concerned. The minutes dragged on, and the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just my classmates, but as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from outside the room. It was faint, like someone speaking in hushed tones just beyond the door. I strained to hear, but the words were indistinguishable. We fell quiet, our eyes darting nervously around the room. Mr. Harris moved to the door, peering through the small window into the hallway. His expression was one of confusion, then concern. He stepped back, his face pale. "Stay quiet and stay put," he whispered. I edged closer to the door, trying to see what Mr. Harris had seen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if beckoning me to come closer. I peered through the window and saw a shadowy figure moving swiftly through the halls, barely visible in the dim light. The figure was tall and shrouded in darkness, its features obscured. But what struck me the most was the trail of frost it left behind. The floor tiles glistened with a thin layer of ice, and the air around the figure seemed to shimmer with cold. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled back from the window. The whispers were louder now, almost urgent. I could feel the temperature dropping further. I glanced at Amanda, who looked just as scared. Time seemed to slow as the whispers continued to fill the hallway. I could hear them more clearly now. It was as if the voices were speaking directly into my mind. The sensation was both unsettling and hypnotic, drawing me toward the door despite my fear. Mr. Harris seemed to sense my urge to investigate further. "Stay away from the door," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The minutes stretched into hours, the lockdown dragging on far longer than usual. The cold grew more intense. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered back on, and the principal's voice crackled over the intercom again. "The lockdown is over. Teachers, please resume your normal activities." Relief washed over the room as we began to move and chatter, the tension breaking. But I noticed that Mr. Harris didn't relax. He kept glancing at the door, his face still pale. Something was definitely not right. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The cold lingered in the hallways, and the whispers seemed to follow me wherever I went. I couldn't concentrate on my classes. I tried to talk to Amanda about it, but she just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a malfunction in the heating system and some overactive imaginations. But I knew what I had seen: the shadowy figure, the trail of frost, the insistent whispers. As the final bell rang and students poured out of the building, I walked slowly to my locker, the whispers still echoing faintly in my ears. As I gathered my things, I felt a sudden chill and turned to see a message scrawled in frost on the locker door. It was a single word: beware. My heart pounded as I looked around, but the hallway was empty. I grabbed my backpack and hurried out of the school, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Who or what was the figure in the hallway? And why had it left me a warning? That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers seemed to follow me home. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the day's events. I felt like I was on the edge of uncovering something significant, something dangerous. In the days that followed, the whispers and the cold persisted. I began to notice strange things happening around the school. Books would fall off shelves for no reason, doors would slam shut on their own, and students reported feeling an inexplicable chill in certain areas of the building. The shadowy figure was spotted by others, always just out of clear view, always leaving a trail of frost in its wake. I could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, its whispers becoming more insistent, more demanding. One evening, armed with a flashlight and my phone, I returned to the school after hours. The building was eerily silent. I made my way to the hallway where I had first seen the figure, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridors. The whispers greeted me as I approached. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. I turned. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the shadowy figure, and the frost spread out from its feet, creeping toward me. "Who are you?" I demanded. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder. I took a step back. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more distinct. The whispers intensified, and I could finally make out some of the words.
"Help me. Trapped. Release."
Whoever, or whatever, this figure was, it was trying to communicate. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "How can I help you?" I asked. The figure paused, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. The whispers seemed to merge into a single voice, clear and desperate. "Find the book, the old library, free me." The old library? A section of the school that had been closed off years ago due to structural issues. No one went there anymore, and it was rumored to be haunted. The figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the darkness. "Hurry," it whispered. I reached the door to the old library. I pushed it open. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old, forgotten books. The whispers followed me, guiding my steps. In the center of the room, I found a pedestal, and on it lay an ancient, leather-bound book. Its cover was embossed with strange symbols. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cover. The whispers swelled to a crescendo, urging me to open it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, drawings, and incantations. As I turned the pages, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I stood in the darkness, the whispers rising into a chaotic chorus of voices. A blinding light erupted from the book, and I felt a rush of cold air. The voices merged into a single powerful command: "Free me." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. The whispers stopped, and the room was plunged into silence. I looked around, half expecting to see the shadowy figure, but it was gone. The air was warmer. The oppressive chill lifted. I closed the book and placed it back on the pedestal. I left the library, the whispers gone, but the memory of the figure and its plea for help burned into my mind. The school returned to normal, the strange occurrences ceased, and the frost and shadows disappeared. But I knew that something had changed. I never spoke of that night to anyone, but I often found myself glancing toward the old library, wondering what secrets it still held and if I had truly freed whatever was trapped there. Our second story takes place in a suburban middle school where an ordinary day was disrupted by an extraordinary and unsettling event. It began innocently enough, with a simple announcement of a substitute teacher, but it ended in a way that would haunt the students and teachers for years to come. I remember the day like it was yesterday. The sky was overcast. As I walked through the halls, I could feel the energy of the students, buzzing with excitement and curiosity. Our regular science teacher, Mr. Thompson, had suddenly fallen ill, and we were to have a substitute. The announcement came over the intercom during homeroom. "Attention students, Mr. Thompson is out sick today. Please welcome your substitute, Mrs. Whitaker." I headed to science class with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. The room was already buzzing with chatter when I arrived. Mrs. Whitaker stood at the front, writing on the chalkboard. She was tall and thin. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a different era, and she wore a necklace with a strange, iridescent stone that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Good morning, class," she said in a voice that was both calm and commanding. "Today, we'll be learning about the properties of light." Her eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something unsettling in her gaze, something that made me feel like she could see right through me. I noticed that the classroom seemed colder than usual. I rubbed my arms, trying to ward off the chill. Mrs. Whitaker's voice droned on, and I found it hard to concentrate. Midway through the lesson, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and a collective gasp rose from the students. Mrs. Whitaker's voice cut through the darkness. "Stay calm, everyone. We'll continue the lesson until the power returns." She struck a match and lit a candle on her desk, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The strange necklace glowed even brighter in the candlelight, casting an otherworldly aura around her. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As she continued the lesson, the shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift, taking on strange shapes. I glanced at my classmates, but they seemed entranced by Mrs. Whitaker's voice. I felt a growing sense of unease, like we were all under some kind of spell. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering just at the edge of my hearing. I looked around. trying to locate the source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The whispering grew louder, and I could see my classmates shifting uneasily in their seats. Mrs. Whitaker's voice rose above the whispers, her tone sharp and commanding. "Focus on the lesson," she said. "Ignore the distractions." I tried to obey, but the whispers were becoming overwhelming. They seemed to be speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The shadows on the walls grew darker, more distinct, and I could swear I saw faces in them, twisted in expressions of fear and desperation. The candle flickered, and the room grew even colder. Mrs. Whitaker continued to lecture, but her voice seemed distant, as if she were speaking from far away. The whispers intensified, all speaking simultaneously. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room was silent. I lowered my hands and looked around. My classmates seemed dazed, as if waking from a deep sleep. Mrs. Whitaker stood at the front of the room, her eyes closed, her face serene. The power came back on with a sudden jolt, the fluorescent lights flickering to life. Mrs. Whitaker opened her eyes and smiled. "Well, it seems our lesson has been interrupted. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow." The bell rang, and we gathered our things. I glanced back at Mrs. Whitaker as I left the room. She was watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but they brushed it off, saying it was just a weird power outage and an eccentric substitute. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept seeing Mrs. Whitaker's face in my mind, her piercing eyes and that strange glowing necklace. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, filled with strange dreams of shadowy figures and whispered voices. The next day, I arrived at school early, eager to see if Mrs. Whitaker would be back. As I walked through the halls, I overheard some students talking about a rumor. Apparently, no one had seen Mrs. Whitaker leave the school the day before. She had simply vanished. I made my way to the science classroom. When I entered, I found Mr. Thompson back in his usual spot, looking healthy and cheerful. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "what happened to Mrs. Whitaker?" He looked at me, puzzled. "Mrs. Whitaker? I'm not sure what you mean. I was feeling a bit under the weather yesterday, but I'm fine now. There was no substitute." My blood ran cold. How could he not remember? I tried to explain what had happened, but he just shook his head, looking concerned. I knew it wasn't a dream. The memory of that day was too vivid, too real, but there was no way to prove it. The other students seemed to have forgotten, or perhaps they chose to forget. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of Mrs. Whitaker began to fade, but I couldn't forget. I felt like I was missing something. One afternoon, I decided to do some research. I went to the school library and started looking through old yearbooks and records, trying to find any mention of Mrs. Whitaker. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I found an old newspaper clipping tucked between the pages of an old yearbook. The article was dated over 50 years ago and detailed the tragic death of a teacher named Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. She had died under mysterious circumstances during a school lockdown. Her body had been found in the science classroom, her face frozen in an expression of terror. She had been wearing a necklace with a strange iridescent stone. I stared at the article. How could this be possible? Yet I had seen her, spoken to her. The whispers and shadows suddenly made sense. She was trying to communicate, trying to reach out from beyond the grave. I closed the yearbook and sat back. The mystery of Mrs. Whitaker might never be fully solved, but I knew one thing for certain. Her spirit was still here, lingering in the school. And the inexplicable events of that day continued to weigh on my mind. Our final story takes place in a small town where a routine school lockdown took a chilling turn. It was a crisp autumn day when the lockdown drill was announced over the intercom. We followed the protocol: lights off, doors locked, and silence maintained. But this time, something felt different. I was in history class, sitting near the back of the room when the announcement came. Our teacher, Miss Thompson, calmly directed us to move quickly and quietly to our designated area, behind a barricaded corner of the classroom away from the door. As we settled into silence, I glanced around at my classmates. Some looked bored, others anxious. Minutes passed, and just as I was starting to relax, I noticed something odd. A faint draft of cold air brushed against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to the window, expecting to see it slightly open or a vent blowing air, but the windows were shut tight, and the air vents were silent. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, almost imperceptible. I strained to listen. It seemed to be coming from the supply closet at the back of the room. We were told to stay put during lockdown drills, but my curiosity made me move. I glanced at Miss Thompson, who was focused on her phone. I quietly got up and tiptoed towards the closet. The scraping grew louder. My hand hesitated over the doorknob. What if it was just a loose shelf or a stray animal? With a deep breath, I turned the handle and opened the closet door. Darkness greeted me, and for a moment I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just shelves stacked with boxes and supplies. Then, a shadowy figure crouched in the corner, obscured by the darkness. I froze. The figure turned towards me, its eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. It seemed to radiate a chilling presence. I stumbled backwards, slamming the closet door shut. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The scraping sound continued, louder now, accompanied by a low guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. "All clear. The lockdown drill is over." Miss Thompson's voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tension. I glanced back at the closet, half expecting the figure to burst out. I couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure from my mind. Who would believe that something sinister lurked in our school during a routine lockdown drill? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind. Had it been a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress, or was there something truly malevolent lurking in the shadows of our school? In the days that followed, I kept a vigilant eye on the supply closet, half expecting the figure to reappear. But the days turned into weeks and nothing else happened. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. It was all real. I never opened that closet again, but I couldn't forget the fear that had gripped me that day.